The sound of breaking glass. Captain Sarah Martinez had always known the sound of helicopter blades. Growing up near Fort, the rhythmic thump of rotors was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. But standing in the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Thunder, listening to the skeptical voices of her male colleagues, she realized that sound would soon define her entire career in ways she never imagined. The year was 1993, and the military had just lifted the ban on women flying combat missions. Sarah was among the first group of female pilots selected for the Apache helicopter program, one of the most demanding and dangerous assignments in the Army. The Apache wasn't just any aircraft. It was a flying tank, armed with Hellfire missiles and a 30 chain gun designed specifically to hunt and destroy enemy targets. Sarah remembered her first day at flight school vividly. The instructor, a grizzled veteran named Colonel Barnes, had looked directly at her and the 3 other women in the group. His weathered face showed no emotion as he spoke words that would echo in her mind for years to come. Ladies, and flying an Apache isn't about proving a point. It's about staying alive and keeping your soldiers alive. The enemy doesn't care about your gender, your background, or your politics. They only care about shooting you down. The training was brutal. 18-hour days became normal. Sarah learned to navigate through complete darkness using only night vision goggles, practiced emergency landings with simulated engine failures, and memorized the location of every switch and button until she could operate them blindfolded. The Apache was incredibly complex, with over 200 switches and controls packed into a cockpit barely large enough for 2 people. Many of her male counterparts had grown up dreaming of flying combat helicopters. They had toy soldiers and model planes, war movies and video games that prepared them mentally for this world. Sarah's path had been different. She had discovered her passion for aviation in college, earning her private pilot's license while studying engineering. Her analytical mind and steady hands made her a natural pilot, but she still faced constant questions about her abilities. The physical demands were intense. The Apache's flight suit alone weighed nearly 20 pounds, and pilots had to carry additional gear including body armor, survival equipment, and weapons. During training exercises, Sarah often flew for 8 hours straight, her body cramped in the confined cockpit, sweat pooling in her boots despite the desert's dry heat. But the mental challenges proved even more difficult. Combat flying required split-second decisions under extreme stress. Sarah had to learn to think like a warrior while maintaining the technical precision needed to operate one of the world's most sophisticated weapon systems. She spent countless hours in simulators, practicing scenarios where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Her fellow pilots watched her carefully during those early months. Some were openly supportive, recognizing her skill and dedication. Others remained skeptical, waiting for her to fail. A few were openly hostile, believing that women had no place in combat roles. Sarah learned to ignore the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the extra scrutiny of her every mistake, and the assumption that any success was due to lowered standards rather than her own abilities. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging night training exercise. Sarah and her gunner, Sergeant Mike Torres, were practicing close air support in mountainous terrain when their communications went dead. They were supposed to provide cover for a simulated ground assault, but without radio contact, they had to rely entirely on visual cues and their own judgment. In the darkness, Sarah spotted muzzle flashes from what appeared to be enemy positions. She maneuvered the Apache through a narrow canyon, using the terrain to mask their approach. The exercise controllers later said it was one of the most impressive displays of tactical flying they had ever witnessed. Sarah had turned a equipment failure into an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of innovative thinking combat pilots needed. Word of her performance spread quickly through the base. For the first time, some of the skeptics began to see her not as a woman trying to prove herself, but as a pilot who happened to be a woman. The distinction was crucial. Sarah wasn't trying to fly like a man or better than a man. She was flying like Sarah Martinez, bringing her own unique strengths to the cockpit. As her training progressed, Sarah learned about the larger context of her mission. The Apache helicopters weren't just weapons, they were protectors. Their primary role was to provide close air support for ground troops, swooping in when soldiers were pinned down or outnumbered. The pilots formed an unbreakable bond with the infantry units they supported. Those soldiers on the ground didn't care about the gender of their air support. They cared about survival. The technical aspects of flying the Apache continued to challenge everyone in the program. The helicopter's targeting system could track multiple enemies simultaneously, while the aircraft maneuvered at high speed just feet above the ground. Pilots had to master something called nap of the earth, flying, staying so low that they were hidden behind hills and buildings, popping up only long enough to engage targets before disappearing again. Sarah excelled at this type of flying. Her engineering background helped her understand the complex systems, while her natural flying ability allowed her to push the aircraft to its limits safely. She learned to read the terrain like a book, using every ridge and valley to her advantage. During one memorable training flight, she managed to approach a target completely undetected by flying through a series of dry creek beds, emerging directly behind the simulated enemy position. The cultural shift happening around them was impossible to ignore. The military was changing, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, but changing nonetheless. Sarah and her fellow female pilots were pioneers, whether they wanted that responsibility or not. Every flight, every mission, every success or failure would be scrutinized and used to judge all women who might follow in their footsteps. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah found strength in the mission itself. She wasn't flying to make a political statement or to prove that women were equal to men. She was flying because American soldiers needed air support, and she was damn good at providing it. The Apache helicopter didn't care about the gender of its pilot. It responded to skill, training, and determination. As her training neared completion, Sarah began to hear rumors about possible deployment. Tensions were rising in various parts of the world, and Apache units were among the first assets commanders requested when situations turned dangerous. The thought of actual combat was both terrifying and exhilarating. All the training, all the preparation, all the doubt and determination had been leading to this moment. The night before her final training evaluation, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, cleaning her flight gear one more time. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. She thought about all the women who had fought for the right to serve in combat roles, and all the women who would follow if she succeeded. But mostly, she thought about the soldiers she might someday protect, young men and women who would depend on her skills and courage when everything went wrong. Tomorrow she would find out if she had earned the right to call herself a combat pilot. The evaluation would test everything she had learned: technical flying skills, weapons systems operation, tactical decision-making, and performance under stress. Pass, and she would receive orders to join an active Apache unit. Fail, and her dream of flying combat missions would end before it truly began. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, set her alarm, and tried to get some sleep. In a few hours, she would climb into an Apache helicopter and prove that the sound of breaking barriers could be just as powerful as the sound of breaking glass. The enemy might not care about her gender, but history certainly would. She was ready to make some history of her own, when everything goes wrong. 2 years after earning her wings, Captain Sarah Martinez found herself stationed at Forward Operating Base Falcon in Iraq. The desert heat was oppressive, reaching temperatures that made the Apache's metal surfaces too hot to touch with bare hands. Sarah had flown dozens of missions since arriving in theater, mostly routine patrols and convoy escorts. But on this particular morning in September, everything felt different. The briefing room was packed with more personnel than usual. Major, the squadron commander, stood before a large map marked with red circles and arrows. His usually calm demeanor showed cracks of tension as he began speaking. Intelligence indicates a large insurgent force has moved into the Rajab district overnight. We have approximately 500 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne conducting a sweep operation in this area. He pointed to a cluster of buildings on the map. Their mission was supposed to be routine, but everything has gone sideways. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, studying the map intently. The area was a maze of narrow streets, tall buildings, and countless hiding spots for enemy fighters. It was exactly the kind of urban terrain that made close air support both desperately needed and incredibly dangerous. The ground commander reports they're taking heavy fire from multiple directions, Major continued. What started as a search operation has turned into a full-scale engagement. The enemy appears to have been waiting for our forces, and they've effectively surrounded the entire unit. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the gravity of the situation. 500 soldiers trapped in hostile territory was every commander's nightmare. Without immediate air support, the casualties could be catastrophic. Apache teams will provide close air support while we work on getting additional ground forces to their position, the major announced. But the weather is complicating everything. We've got a sandstorm moving in from the west, and visibility is dropping fast. Sarah glanced out the window. The sky was already taking on the distinctive brown haze that preceded a major sandstorm. Flying in such conditions was dangerous enough during training exercises. In combat, with enemy fighters actively trying to shoot them down, it could be suicidal. Martinez and Torres, your team leader for this mission, Major said, looking directly at Sarah. Gibson and will be your wingman. The ground forces are calling for immediate assistance, so we need you airborne in 15 minutes. As the briefing broke up, Sarah felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and focused calm that came before combat missions. She had trained for this moment countless times, but training simulations couldn't replicate the knowledge that real soldiers were dying while she prepared her helicopter. Sergeant Torres was already conducting the pre-flight inspection when Sarah reached their Apache. The two had flown together for over a year now, developing the kind of seamless partnership that made them one of the most effective teams in the squadron. Torres handled the weapons systems while Sarah focused on flying, but both could operate the other's equipment if necessary. Radio chatter suggests it's pretty bad down there, Torres said as he checked the 30 ammunition. The ground commander is requesting immediate close air support, and they're running low on medical supplies. Sarah nodded while inspecting the Hellfire missiles mounted on the Apache's stub wings. Each missile cost more than most people earned in a year, but right now they represented the difference between life and death for the surrounded soldiers. She ran through her pre-flight checklist quickly, but thoroughly, knowing that any mechanical failure during combat could doom both her crew and the soldiers depending on them. The sandstorm was intensifying as they lifted off. Visibility dropped from miles to mere hundreds of yards as they flew toward the embattled area. Sarah had to rely heavily on her instruments and GPS navigation, occasionally catching glimpses of the ground through brief gaps in the swirling sand. "Apache lead, this is Chaos 6, crackled a voice over the radio. The stress in the ground commander's voice was unmistakable. "We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Enemy appears to be using the storm as cover to move closer to our perimeter. We have wounded who need immediate evacuation but can't get a clear route to the landing zone." "Chaos 6, Apache lead copies," Sarah responded. "We're 2 minutes out from your position. Can you mark enemy positions with smoke?" "Negative on the smoke. Wind is too strong, and we don't want to give away our own positions. Enemy is using rooftops and upper floors of buildings approximately 200 meters north and east of our location." Sarah switched her radio to communicate with her wingman. "Apache 2, are you picking up any heat signatures on thermal?" "Affirmative, lead. I count at least a dozen hot spots in the buildings to the north. Looks like they've got fighting positions prepared on multiple floors." The tactical situation was clear but challenging. The enemy had chosen their positions well, using the urban terrain and weather conditions to their advantage. Sarah would have to get close enough to accurately engage the targets while avoiding both enemy fire and the numerous obstacles created by the storm. "Torres, bring up the targeting system," Sarah instructed her gunner. "We're going to make our approach from the west, using that row of damaged buildings for cover." "Roger that. TADS is up and running," Torres replied, referring to the target acquisition and designation site system that gave Apache crews their incredible precision. Sarah descended until the helicopter was flying barely 50 feet above the ground, using a technique called contour flying to stay hidden behind the irregular urban landscape. The rotor wash stirred up additional dust and debris, making visibility even worse, but it also helped mask their approach from enemy fighters. "I've got multiple muzzle flashes on the thermal display," Torres reported. "Looks like they're concentrating fire on the southwestern corner of the friendly perimeter." Through breaks in the storm, Sarah could see tracer rounds streaking through the air. The surrounded soldiers were fighting desperately, but they were clearly and running low on ammunition. Every minute that passed increased their danger. "Apache lead, Chaos 6, came the urgent radio call. "We've got wounded soldiers in a building that's partially collapsed. The medics can't reach them because of sniper fire from the building directly across the street." Sarah immediately understood the problem. The enemy snipers had a clear field of fire across the narrow street, making any rescue attempt potentially fatal. But the Apache's powerful weapons could level the building if necessary. "Chaos 6, can you confirm no civilians in the target building?" Affirmative lead. Intel shows the building was abandoned months ago. We've observed enemy fighters moving in and out all morning. Sarah maneuvered the Apache into position, fighting against strong wind gusts that threatened to push the helicopter into nearby structures. The sandstorm was reaching its peak intensity, turning the world into a brown, swirling nightmare. "Tors, I need a precision shot on the third-floor eastern windows," Sarah commanded. "Use the chain gun first to suppress, then follow with a hellfire if necessary." "Target acquired," Tors responded. "Engaging now." The Apache's 30 chain gun erupted with its distinctive buzzing sound, sending high-explosive rounds through the windows where muzzle flashes had been spotted. The enemy fire from that position immediately stopped, allowing the medics on the ground to begin their rescue operation. But the engagement had revealed the Apache's position to other enemy fighters throughout the area. Almost immediately, small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades began streaking toward the helicopter. Sarah threw the Apache into a series of violent evasive maneuvers, using every building and piece of cover available. "Multiple launch signatures," Tors warned. "RPGs coming from several positions." Sarah pulled the helicopter up and over a partially destroyed mosque, feeling the aircraft shudder as fragments from an exploding rocket peppered the armored hull. The Apache was built to survive such hits, but too many successful strikes could bring down even the toughest helicopter. "Apache 2, I need you to engage the RPG positions on the eastern buildings while I provide cover for the medical evacuation," Sarah radioed to her wingman. "Copy that, lead. I see the positions. Engaging now." The next few minutes became a deadly dance between the two Apache helicopters and dozens of enemy fighters spread throughout the urban landscape. Sarah found herself flying patterns she had never practiced, improvising tactics as the situation demanded. The sandstorm continued to reduce visibility, making every maneuver potentially fatal. But gradually, the volume of enemy fire began to decrease. The precision weapons of the Apache helicopters were having their intended effect, forcing enemy fighters to abandon exposed positions and reducing their ability to coordinate attacks on the surrounded soldiers. "Chaos 6, Apache lead," Sarah called over the radio. "Can you give me a status update on the wounded evacuation?" "Apache lead, we've successfully recovered the wounded from the collapsed building, but we're still taking heavy fire from positions to the north, and our ammunition situation is becoming critical." Sarah realized that this mission was far from over. The sandstorm showed no signs of letting up. The enemy forces were larger than initially estimated, and her own Apache was already showing battle damage from the intense fighting. But 500 American soldiers were depending on her and her wingman to keep them alive until reinforcements could arrive. The real test of everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, was just beginning, the longest hour. The sandstorm reached its full fury just as Sarah received the most devastating radio call of her military career. Through the crackling static came a voice filled with barely controlled panic. "Apache lead, Chaos 6 actual. We have a medical emergency. Multiple casualties from a coordinated mortar attack. We need immediate extraction for critical wounded, but all our planned extraction routes are compromised. Enemy has repositioned during the storm and we're completely pinned down." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The situation had gone from dangerous to catastrophic. The surrounded soldiers weren't just fighting for tactical advantage anymore. They were fighting for survival. And the sandstorm that provided cover for the Apache helicopters was also preventing any ground reinforcements or medical evacuation aircraft from reaching the area. "Chaos 6, what's the status of your perimeter?" Sarah asked while maneuvering to avoid another barrage of rocket-propelled grenades. "We're holding, but barely. Ammunition is critically low, and we've got at least 20 soldiers who need immediate medical attention. The medics are doing what they can, but we need to get the worst cases to a field hospital within the hour, or we're going to lose them." Tor's voice came over the intercom with grim efficiency. "Sarah, I'm showing massive heat signatures moving through the buildings to the south. Looks like they're trying to mass for a final assault on the American positions." Through her thermal imaging system, Sarah could see what Tors had spotted. Despite the blinding sandstorm, enemy fighters were repositioning in large numbers. They were using the reduced visibility to concentrate their forces for what appeared to be an overwhelming attack on the weakest part of the American perimeter. Apache 2, are you seeing this movement to the south? Sarah radioed to her wingman. Affirmative, lead. I count at least 40 to 50 fighters moving through those buildings. If they get into position, they'll have overlapping fields of fire on the entire southern defensive line. The tactical situation was becoming impossible. The American soldiers were outnumbered, running low on ammunition, dealing with serious casualties, and about to face a coordinated assault by fresh enemy forces. The Apache helicopters were their only immediate source of support, but the weather conditions made precision firing extremely difficult. Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable during peacetime training. She was going to take the Apache down to street level, flying between buildings in zero visibility conditions to get close enough for accurate fire support. It was incredibly dangerous, potentially suicidal, but it might be the only way to break up the enemy assault before it could begin. Tors, I'm going to need you to guide me through the streets using thermal imaging. We're going in low and close. Roger that, but Sarah, the rotor clearance in those streets is going to be measured in feet, not yards. And if we hit a power line or building corner in this visibility. I know the risks, but those soldiers down there don't have another option. Sarah descended until the Apache was flying barely 20 feet above the narrow street, the rotor wash creating a hurricane of sand and debris. Tors called out obstacles and threats with machine-like precision, while Sarah flew entirely on instruments and verbal guidance. The stress was enormous. One moment of inattention or miscommunication could send them crashing into a building. Building corner coming up on the right, clear, power lines overhead. We're under them. Muzzle flashes from the second-story windows left side. The Apache's chain gun fired in controlled bursts, each round precisely placed to eliminate enemy positions without risking civilian areas or friendly forces. Sarah had to constantly adjust for wind gusts that threatened to push the helicopter off course or into obstacles. Multiple RPG signatures from the rooftops, Tors warned. They're trying to get elevation on us. Sarah pulled the Apache up and over a 3-story building, feeling the aircraft shudder as rocket-propelled grenades exploded just below them. The enemy fighters had anticipated her tactics and positioned anti-aircraft weapons to counter the low-level approach. Apache lead, Chaos 6. Your fire support just broke up a major assault formation. Enemy appears to be falling back from the southern positions. The news provided a moment of relief, but Sarah knew it was temporary. The enemy forces were regrouping, not retreating. They would try again, and next time they would be better prepared for the Apache's tactics. Apache 2, I need you to take the high patrol while I continue close support, Sarah radioed to her wingman. Watch for more repositioning movements and warn me about incoming missiles. Copy that, lead. I've got overwatch. For the next 30 minutes, Sarah flew a pattern that no helicopter pilot had ever attempted in combat conditions. She threaded the Apache through narrow streets, around buildings, under bridges and overpasses, all while engaging enemy targets and coordinating with ground forces. Tors performed magnificently, switching between weapon systems and navigation guidance without missing a beat. But the Apache was taking damage. Small arms fire had punctured several non-critical systems, and one lucky RPG had damaged part of the tail assembly. The helicopter was still flyable, but for how much longer? Chaos 6 Apache lead, what's your current status? Apache lead, we've managed to stabilize most of the wounded, but we still need immediate extraction for the critical cases. The storm is supposed to break in about 20 minutes. Can you maintain support until then? Sarah checked her instruments. Fuel was becoming a concern, ammunition was running low, and the damaged tail assembly was causing increasing vibration throughout the aircraft. But the alternative was abandoning 500 soldiers to almost certain death. Affirmative, Chaos 6, will maintain station. The radio suddenly crackled with a new voice. Apache lead, this is 7-5. We're inbound with 2 medical evacuation helicopters, but we need a secure landing zone. Sarah felt a surge of hope. The medical evacuation helicopters could save the most seriously wounded soldiers, but only if they could land safely. That meant clearing and securing a landing zone in the middle of an active combat area during a sandstorm. 7-5 Apache lead. The primary landing zone is still under enemy observation. I'm going to clear an alternate site 2 blocks west of the main fighting position. What followed was the most intense 10 minutes of Sarah's military career. She and Tors systematically eliminated every enemy position that could threaten the landing zone, using a combination of precise chain gun fire and carefully placed Hellfire missiles. Apache 2 provided overwatch and engaged targets that tried to reposition during the clearing operation. The sandstorm began to subside just as the medical evacuation helicopters approached the landing zone. Visibility improved enough for Sarah to see the desperate courage of the soldiers on the ground as they carried their wounded comrades to the evacuation aircraft under continuing enemy fire. Apache Lead 75, we have all critical patients loaded. Thank you for the cover. These soldiers owe you their lives. As the medical helicopters departed with their precious cargo, Sarah realized that reinforcements were finally arriving. She could see additional Apache helicopters approaching through the clearing storm, along with ground vehicles carrying fresh ammunition and supplies for the surrounded soldiers. Apache Lead, this is Thunder 6, came a new voice over the radio. We're bringing additional air support and a relief force. You and your wingman are cleared to return to base for refuel and rearm. Sarah acknowledged the order, but as she turned the damaged Apache toward home base, she realized something profound had occurred during those harrowing hours. The gender barriers that had seemed so important during her training had completely disappeared under the pressure of combat. The soldiers on the ground hadn't cared that their air support was provided by a woman. They had cared that she was skilled, brave, and willing to risk everything to keep them alive. Tor's voice came over the intercom as they flew back through the desert. Sarah, I've flown with a lot of pilots, but what you did back there, threading this bird through those streets in zero visibility while taking fire, I've never seen anything like it. As they approached forward operating Base Falcon, Sarah could see ground crews already preparing for their arrival. Word of the mission had spread throughout the base, and she knew there would be debriefings, reports, and probably some uncomfortable attention from higher command. But none of that mattered as much as the radio call that came through just as they were landing. Apache Lead Chaos 6, all 500 soldiers accounted for and secure. The relief force has reached our position and the area is now under friendly control. On behalf of every soldier in this unit, thank you. You saved our lives today. Sarah shut down the Apache's engines and sat quietly in the cockpit for a moment. The helicopter around her was damaged from the intense fighting, but it had brought her and Tors home safely. More importantly, it had enabled them to bring 500 American soldiers home safely as well. As she climbed down from the cockpit, Sarah noticed that none of her colleagues seemed surprised by what she had accomplished. The skeptical looks and whispered doubts from her early training days were gone, replaced by the simple respect that one warrior gives to another. She had proven that women could fly combat helicopters not through words or political arguments, but through the most convincing demonstration possible, courageous and effective action under fire. The enemy had indeed been wrong. They had said women couldn't fly combat helicopters, but Captain Sarah Martinez and her Apache had just proved that wrong in the most definitive way possible. 500 soldiers were alive because a woman and her crew had refused to accept limitations that existed only in other people's minds. Years later, when Sarah became an instructor pilot herself, she would tell her students that the most important lesson from that day wasn't about gender or breaking barriers. It was about the fundamental truth that in combat, what matters isn't who you are, but what you're willing to do when everything is on the line. The Apache helicopter responds to skill, courage, and determination, qualities that have nothing to do with gender and everything to do with the human spirit.